Coming up in this episode, Gary Oldman playing Beethoven.
Inaccuracies and the bombardment of so-called facts hits you like a Mel Gibson film.
Can we just ditch the romance stuff?
The director's trying to weave his own story here.
There's two candidates for who this letter is addressed to historically, neither of which appear in this film. Welcome back to the Historical Movies Podcast. My name is Ross, and I'm delighted to welcome a returning guest, Jack C.T. Adams, PhD student in contemporary composition.
Yes, yeah.
Right, I've got that right. Okay, should have prepared that before. Anyway, Jack, great to have you back. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me back on the podcast.
Always a pleasure. Today we're doing Immortal Beloved, the Gary Oldman film about Ludwig van Beethoven. So we wanted to get your expertise, your musical knowledge to explain to us why Beethoven is so important. And we'll go into the history of Beethoven, where he's from, the background, how that influences music. And of course, listeners will go through our wonderful list of questions and have a discussion about trivia and so on. But first of all, Jack, I just wanted to ask you a few warm-up questions so our audience can get to know you. What's the last movie you saw? Unless it was this one, in which case tell me the penultimate movie that you saw.
Actually, the last movie I saw was SpongeBob the movie. I was at a family event and there was some kids about, so that's what we had on. But the last sort of like historical film that I actually put on for my own enjoyment was The Two Popes.
Oh yes.
So Pope Francis had passed, and you had done the film on the podcast.
Yep.
And so
it's not bad, is it?
No, I really enjoyed it actually.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think Hopkins and Price are brilliant together. I just want to watch them together, to be honest. I'm not really. Anyway, listeners, we've done an episode, so you can go and have a listen to it. I didn't like all of the flashback history stuff. Bryce loved it, so we had a great discussion. So, what have you got a favorite historical movie?
Yeah, I've got a few. Historical movies are actually sort of my favorite type of movies. So I think the one that had the most impact on me was probably Cry Freedom, the Attenborough film set around the experiences of Steve Biko and Donald Woods in apartheid South Africa.
We've got to get onto that on the podcast. We haven't covered it yet, but we will do one day.
Yeah, you definitely should.
If you could make a movie about a historical period, what would it be? Have you got a favorite historical period?
I had sort of two ideas for this. In terms of music, I obviously, a lot of my research is in sort of like a contemporary, classical, postmodern sort of music. So I think it would be nice to see a film set around some of the more recent composers, someone like Steve Reich, Pierre Boulez, Stockhausen, someone like that, because I think the impact they've had on sort of contemporary music, both in popular and mainstream, but also sort of the classical world has been really, really big. So it'd be nice to see that sort of shown through a movie. But in terms of in like a non-musical period, a lot of my sort of interest in history and stuff is in like religious history. So I think it'd be cool to see a bit more, modern movies exploring different periods of sort of ancient religion or
that would be interesting.
Yeah. Or even more recent events, sort of like Vatican II or something like that,
My answer to this question would always be something in prehistory, because I just can't think of any movies that are particularly good about prehistory. So when did you first see, we'll get on to Immortal Beloved then. When did you first see this movie?
Well, I actually saw it rather recently. It was after we did Amadeus for the podcast. I was talking to a family member and they said, have you watched Immortal Beloved? And I hadn't. And so, I watched it just after Amadeus.
Probably the best time to watch it. Yeah, I think this movie borrows a lot, doesn't it, from Amadeus? So I certainly had the feeling that it was kind of in the shadow of Amadeus. We've done an episode, of course, the last time you were on, we did Amadeus. That's an absolutely wonderful movie. I love that movie.
It is.
This movie I'd also never heard of. And if you just have the tagline, you've got Gary Oldman playing Beethoven, I just think I'm in. I want to see that movie.
Yes.
But before we get on to that, before we get on to the movie, can you explain to us, because one of the criticisms I would have maybe of this movie is that it doesn't do a brilliant job of explaining why the importance of Beethoven, the importance of his work, why he was so revolutionary, and revolutionary is probably a good word to use, thinking about the time period. So what is it from the musical history kind of perspective that makes him significant?
Yeah, well, no, I'd agree. This doesn't really feel like a film that's about Beethoven as a composer, but it does fall short, I feel, of showing why he's such an important part of musical history. Beethoven sits on sort of the bridge between the classical period and the romantic period. And whenever we look at periods of classical music or orchestral music that are changing, is usually you're seeing is the constraints of one period is sort of being removed by composers. So the earlier back you go, the more rigid, the more structured, the more formulaic music is. And as you get closer to more modern music, you can sort of feel like all those chains are being removed and composers are able to work more freely and expressive. So, that is what we're seeing is he was one of the pioneers of the romantic period, which is, you come from a very structured classical period and then you go to a very emotional and expressive period where the music almost tells more of a story than before. They're able to have sort of these motifs and these melodies that really carry a story through the passages. So from that, it can seem quite simple to say, but the thing that he was so good at was bringing his raw emotions into his work, able to connect with audiences to show sort of how he feels within his music. But he was also technically brilliant. He was able to write pieces of music that just pushed the boundaries of what performers were able to do at that time.
Yeah, I read that he got quite annoyed by the limitations of the instruments, and the sound that you hear in this movie is actually all done on a modern piano, which apparently is, it sounds different, has much more range apparently than the instruments you would have heard back in his day. So first inaccuracy there. Time for a very short interruption. It's Ross here. Thanks very much for listening on YouTube. Don't forget to check out all of our other episodes, and we'd love to hear from you, so leave us a comment. And any sharing or liking or subscribing you can do would really help the podcast. So thanks a lot. But we should also mention, of course, that he's born in Bonn in 1770. And this is the Enlightenment, the ideas of liberty and the individual coming to the fore more and more, and the age of reasoning. And I've read a little quote that says basically he's the first composer that's like a proper individual genius instead of a servant of aristocratic patronage. And I thought that was a great little sentence to basically, even we've seen in Amadeus that he's fighting constantly with the Duke, I don't know, the 8th Count of Burgundy or whatever these bloody nobles are called, and they're constantly trying to get him to write like a little opera for him. And Mozart wants to be a bit more, expressive. He wants to write stuff for maybe some ordinary people or whatever. And Beethoven comes like a generation later, doesn't he? And he seems a bit more unshackled because of that background in the French Revolution, of course, happens, I think, when he's 19 or so. And so there's that kind of explosion of liberty and those ideas. Previously, it was all kind of in the classical period, a bit more shackled, and in the romantic period, a bit more, a bit more freedom. Is that broadly correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think what I always like to mention whenever talking about sort of earlier periods of orchestral music is the sort of the hold that aristocracy has. And I mean, if you go a bit earlier than that, it's usually the church and religion, because these are the two places where the money is in the periods, and that's where the funds come for composers. So Beethoven was certainly one of the first composers to push against sort of this aristocracy of the time. But I think we still see that actually it plays a big part in his life and his career. So although he's able to write maybe a bit more freely, he's able to, early on in his third symphony was dedicated to Napoleon until he withdrew that. But so you can see he's able to express opinions that were probably not very popular among the aristocrats. But it's still those sorts of people who are paying for a lot of his life. He was paid a sum of money to actually stay in Vienna. He was offered a job elsewhere as a bandmaster for a court, and it was his patrons, which was a bunch of aristocrats in Vienna, who actually ended up paying him a yearly fee if he would stay in Vienna. We also see that he was believed to have proposed and wanted to be wed, but the father of the bride refused because he didn't have any rank. He didn't have any sort of status or class rank. So yeah, he pushed against those boundaries, but I think just of the time, it's hard for even the most Republican composer to really get away from the aristocracy.
It's a difficult thing, isn't it, to sort of wrap your head around in the modern world. But I think you mentioned Napoleon, and I think that's a really good point that he dedicated music to Napoleon and was very much in favor of the transformation that Napoleon was bringing about until he proclaimed himself emperor. But I think it's interesting to mention some of the contradictions in Beethoven's personality, which make him such an fascinating. For me, he's a much more fascinating personality, it would seem, than composers that came before Mozart and Bach and things like that. Because I also read that there was some confusion about the fact that he's Ludwig van Beethoven, as in Ludwig von Beethoven. But if you're Ludwig von Beethoven, this gives you an aristocratic title. The von is the kind of a aristocratic thing. And he was always coy about confirming or denying that it was von or van. And he kind of played it a little bit. Yes, he was very much in favor of the ideals of the French Revolution. But as you said, he also had some patronage within the nobility. He also stormed out of some nobles' performances. I'll come on to a list of his great rock star achievements. I think this guy's honestly like the first rock star. Reading about Beethoven's life is fascinating. But there are contradictions. He's living in a time of change from one system to a newer system. So I think it must have been a great brief for Gary Oldman coming into this saying, you're playing Ludwig van Beethoven, you've got loads of mental health issues, you've got loads of emotional baggage, and you're born in this incredible time of change coming into the Enlightenment. So with all of that considered, with that historical background, which we'll discuss as we go through as well, do you think this film gives, perhaps it's not the brief, perhaps we're being unfair, it's not really the brief of this movie, is it? Like in Amadeus, to explain why Beethoven is such an important cultural figure. But I'm going to ask the question: do you think this film does a good job of covering what we've just talked about? I don't at all. It didn't give me any of that real background.
No, I agree. I don't think it really did a good job of that. And you're right. Maybe it's not really the purpose of the film. Maybe to do that. Maybe that wasn't the intentions. Maybe it's the goal was people already know sort of the background of Beethoven, and they're exploring a new thing that isn't always touched upon. You know, it's quite interesting to sort of see the women of Beethoven's life and the importance, you know, that they played on him as a composer, because a lot of his music was dedicated to these women who he shared his life with. So, you know, it's an interesting thing. But I think the problem is it tries to do a bit of both. I feel like it tries to cover a lot of different parts of his life, and some of it is just too short, just not enough of it. And so you know, perhaps I thought if this was sort of like a in modern times, if they made this sort of like a 6-part Netflix drama, then
when we get onto the question later of too long and too short, and this movie's, I think, about 2 hours,
yeah, 2 hours.
which is perfect for the movie. But I was thinking the themes that this movie brings up, it's really quite an unfocused film. It's very enjoyable, but this could probably do with a 6-part Netflix series, because we've got obviously the main focus, which is Beethoven's love life, which I personally, when you're talking about the fact we've got Napoleon and the Enlightenment and this amazing composer, that would be that would be lowest on my list of things to focus on for a movie. Anyway, we've also got the custody battle for his nephew, which really gets going in the second half, and then we have this thing later of the hardships he had as a kid and explaining some of the reasons why he's such a grumpy character, a violent father, which, as I understand, there is no basis in his history for that. We don't know whether his father beat him, but so it seems quite unfocused to me. It's like basically at its heart, it's like a romance detective film. That's basically the plotting to begin with. And you're thinking, okay, we're going to go on this little journey to find out who the Immortal Beloved is. This letter that Beethoven wrote, and we don't know who it's addressed to, and we still don't know who it's addressed to. But we'll discuss that in a minute. But then it kind of gets a bit lost for me, or it kind of gets maybe a little bit confused with all these other things going on, which sure are important, but they seem to, particularly the stuff about his childhood and the Ninth Symphony being this kind of revelatory experience for him, to getting over the fact that his father beat him. That just, for me, just came out of the blue. It's like, okay, this is another strand we're talking about here, is it? Okay, the sequence, when he runs away and he lies in the river and we see the stars reflecting on the river and so on. So, yeah, for me, it was like a kind of a little bit unfocused. How did you feel about that?
This film, the director's trying to sort of weave his own historical story here, that isn't supported by a lot of history or a lot of scholars.
Well, let's just say it's bull. Basically,
yeah.
Story, as far as we can tell, we've got to say that. Yeah,
there are a few elements that are based on some historical records. But for the most part, this is, the director trying to weave his own story. And so, I was unsure if, for me, I was sort of trying to think, is the flashbacks to his childhood trying to explain his almost cruelty to his nephew and his sister-in-law. It's quite a cruel thing to put two family members through after the death of another family member, to sort of take them through court and, take a child away from someone. And so I thought, is this him trying to come up with an explanation why Beethoven might have these feelings? Why might he be so cruel involving this child?
Yeah,
But
which is a very. I should sorry to jump in, but I think that's a very good thing to do, because a lot of movies don't. We just have, goodies and baddies, and the baddies are not explained in a very good way. I know the modern trope of superhero films is we've got to feel a bit sorry for the
mm,
baddie. It's not about feeling sorry for them. It's about understanding why they've been made bad. What circumstances have led to that, really? So, this movie does a great job of that. But I just think, okay, but hang on, it starts off as a romance detective
yeah,
story, so it's
yeah,
a bit muddled, isn't it?
I agree. And I think it's a really important thing to do when you're talking about any historical figure, especially someone like Beethoven, who, we'll probably get onto, but someone like Schindler spent a lot of his career trying to make sure Beethoven was seen as the perfect man. But I think it is important, if you do any sort of, trying to have any sort of accuracies, to show that he wasn't this perfect man. He was a genius, and he was beloved for his music and his compositions, but he was known to be a difficult man. He was known to be stubborn. He was known to have a temper. And so I think it is good to sort of show this and maybe come up with explanations, even if they're not, based on a lot of historical evidence. But I do think that it just doesn't have enough time as a film, as a standalone film. There just isn't the time to get through all these points to make a cohesive story of how they all link up.
Agreed. Yeah. So we should, or I should clear up maybe why I called the historical plotting in this bull. It's because it obviously revolves around this immortal beloved letter,
Yes.
which was discovered by Anton Schindler, his secretary, after he died in March 1827.
Hmm.
And the letter was written probably on the 6th and 7th of July, 1812, likely written in Teplitz in the modern Czech Republic. And basically, we're still not 100% sure who that letter is composed to. It's a gushing letter of, well, Immortal Beloved says it all, doesn't it? So
Yes.
it's a proclamation of love. I was shocked to discover that it appears to me there's two main candidates for who this letter is addressed to historically,
Hmm.
neither of which appear in this film. We have then three love interests, which get increasingly more ridiculous, as far as I can tell, in this movie, particularly with the reveal that it's his sister-in-law that is his immortal beloved, which countless historians say that the director of this movie, Bernard Rose, just made up, but it's just complete rubbish. It gives an interesting twist, but historically, it's just not considered really possible. Yeah, before I nail down the details, because it is quite complicated but interesting. If you've got anything to add, then Jack, about this, because in the movie we have the three women. We have Giulietta Shui Giordani. I can't pronounce her name. We've got Countess Anna Marie Erodi and Joanna Rice. I suppose you would say that. That was a tour de force of mispronunciations. Apologies, but it's basically said at the end that the sister-in-law is the immortal beloved, which historically is there's an almost 0% chance that that's true. And in fact, the other two that appear in the movie are contenders, but thought very unlikely.
Yes. And I think it's interesting, actually, because the two main sort of potential women who could fit this immortal beloved uh, role, in many ways actually have a more interesting story that could be
Yeah,
explored in the film. The both, I believe both women who are the top contenders within 8 and 9 months of the letter had a child. And they believed that the letter talked about sort of consummating their relationship and stuff like that. So, potentially, there's certainly, one of them had a daughter that is believed to be Beethoven's daughter, and yet none of this is actually really explored. But I think
yeah.
it starts off, on the again, it's trying to sort of play it as this, romance detective, but it's just sets up the premise straight away. The first thing is they're talking about a will, And there's no link between this letter and it being a will. The will was sort of believed it was going to his nephew. Carl was the one who was inheriting anything left over by Beethoven. His brothers had no say in it. I know one of them had passed by the time he died, but so the whole sort of premise of this is an argument over who inherits sort of the estate of Beethoven. Again, it's just a false part of history.
It's also a really badly acted and directed scene.
Yes, I
At the
agree.
beginning, I think there's some rough scenes in this movie. There's some brilliant ones. It's mainly from Mr. Oldman, but
Yes.
some of the acting, particularly at the beginning. So I better drill down then. There's two candidates that historians think most likely. The most likely one, as I understand it, is a woman called Anthony Brentando, who was a well-educated woman married to a merchant, a Frankfurt merchant. And Beethoven mentions in his other letters, that the date of their last meeting was the 2nd of July, 1812. And they're both historically known, both her and Beethoven are known to have been in Prague at the time. And as you said, she became, after the letter, she became a mother 8 months later. And the father is presumed to be Beethoven, giving birth to a child called Carl Joseph. Also, some of Beethoven's journals mention the Immortal Beloved began with a T, and her name is Antony, but she was known as Tony as a short version. So it's thought that that's probably who he's addressing. The second one is a lady called Josephine Brunswick, who is a Hungarian countess and former piano student. So not the countess we see in this movie, a different one, a piano student, a former piano student of Beethoven. Her husband suddenly dies in 1804. Then it's believed Beethoven was her lover for several years until she remarried in 1810, basically because, as you mentioned earlier, she wasn't able to marry down because Beethoven didn't have status. She's got to marry into the aristocracy. She then leaves that husband 2 years later, which is the same time, 1812, the same time that Beethoven writes the letter. She has a daughter 9 months after that called, very interestingly, called Minona, which is anonym, which in German means anonymous. So it's like a code almost. It's like the Da Vinci Code. And Ludwig van Beethoven wrote several letters to her, and one ends with "Forever yours." So it's probably one of those two women, and not the three that we get in this movie.
Yeah, no, I agree. I would, I'm not a scholar on this particular part of Beethoven's life, but I would agree. Looking at all the evidence, these are the two most likely people, and I think two people who have incredibly interesting stories to not be explored in this film.
Yeah, it's a bizarre choice. I don't quite understand it. Bernard Rose wrote and directed this, so it's all come from his head. I don't know what's going on in there. We have to mention, I think, because we both because last time you were on, we talked about Amadeus, and because this movie, I think, is in the shadow of Amadeus. In fact, particularly the first scene when we hear like the Fifth Symphony, dun, 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 as he's dying in bed,
Yes.
I was like, okay, so this is basically a ripoff of Amadeus. Maybe that's unfair because Amadeus, I think, such a wonderful movie that this was made 10 years later than Amadeus. Amadeus is mid-80s, this is mid-90s. But it owes a lot to it, doesn't it? Veteran American film critic Emmanuel Levy gave Immortal Beloved a C rating. He said it lacks the vibrant energy and charm of Amadeus, which I would agree with. I also think it's unfocused. I think there's too many strands of thematic strands in this. But how do you think? How do you compare this to Amadeus, Jack?
Yeah, it's hard not to sort of compare them, obviously, because they're talking about two of the greatest composers who lived at parts of their lives, at the same time, lived in the same city, and so there's obviously so many parallels between the two composers that if you have two films that come out within about a decade of each other, they're going to have a lot of comparisons. And the films, as in terms of technically, that they both are quite similar. They were both filmed in Prague, I believe. So they both feel like they're in the same location, which is quite good because they're both supposed to be in Vienna. So, you watch one film and you get an idea of what Vienna is supposed to be like, and you watch the next film and it's almost like it is the same Vienna that they're trying to portray. But I think it's hard to compare them as two sort of biographical things of composers because there is so little that is actually sort of explored of Beethoven as a composer. Amadeus does a better job of exploring the musical personality of Mozart. I think it did a better job of sort of exploring his rivalry within sort of other composers, his sort of relationship with his audiences, the relationship with the aristocracy. You know, for example, like in this film, we see sort of the outside sort of relationship that Beethoven has with the aristocracy, but we don't get a lot of scenes where we see him actually sort of with audiences, with fans, with his patrons, with so we sort of have to infer a lot of what happens there. Um,
I also think that as good as Gary Oldman is in this, and I think he gives a really good performance. One of the film critic called him. It makes the top 5. Josh Winning of Total Film says it's one of the top 5 Oldman performances, which I think is right. But I still think F. Murray Abraham, who plays Salieri in Amadeus, is better than this, giving
yes,
one of the great cinematic performances, in my opinion. So it's even topped. I can hear the pitch meeting for Immortal Beloved, and it goes like this: it's Amadeus with Gary Oldman as Beethoven, and they're like, okay, here's a blank check. How much do you want?
yes.
Because Amadeus was also massively financially successful. I read that this movie, although I couldn't find the exact data for the budget, I don't believe this. I've read that it cost $120 million. Now, in 1994, that is an astronomical amount of money.
Yes, that's a lot.
I think Forrest Gump cost 55 million, came out in the same year. And
Wow.
I can't imagine that this is more expensive than Forrest Gump. Anyway, it's definitely cost more than it took. It only took 9.9 at the box office, 9.9 million, not $9.9. Only Gary Oldman went to see it. Yeah, so I think it kind of, I don't know. I think I don't know whether again it's the unfocusedness or the marketing or something, but it kind of gotten lost. And I've never heard of Immortal Beloved. I'm glad I've seen it now. It was very enjoyable, but it kind of seems to have been forgotten a little bit.
Yeah, and I think part of what makes it feel sort of lots of loose threads is Amadeus is essentially 2 characters and their relationship with each other, and I think the main focus of Amadeus is Salieri, and you could argue it's also about him and his relationship with God, but so throughout the whole film we have Mozart and we have Salieri, and they're the 2 people who are really playing off each other. Whereas in this film, we're, introduced to sort of 3 people who are taking on the role of Immortal Beloved. But so it's spread across 3 people, over sort of the 3 parts of the film. So none of them really have the opportunity to become the counterpart to Beethoven. It's very sort of quickly like get someone new in, give them a bit of background. Okay, let's move on to the next person.
But there is a scene which I think comes right in the middle of this movie where Schindler basically explains why he thinks Beethoven's a genius. And Beethoven said that the music should hypnotize you into feeling the emotions that the composer felt when he was writing it. And then Schindler in the movie spontaneously weeps when Beethoven is clearing up the fact that I can't remember which piece of music it is, but it's about a lover who's in a carriage and the carriage can't move and he's in the middle of the forest and it's raining and it's horrible. So that's one part of this movie that does try to explain that. I don't think that works at all. That scene, it didn't convince me of Beethoven, but I think what is more convincing is Gary Oldman's performance, which I think gives a really, although some of it is fictionalized in what we see, from reading about Beethoven, gives a really good kind of wow, this guy's got some serious emotion bubbling right under the surface. And I just want to go through a few things, how I believe that Beethoven is the original rock star. So Beethoven once broke a chair over a servant who had made a trivial mistake in food preparation. He threw food at a waiter in a restaurant once because he was unhappy. He reportedly became so frustrated with a badly cooked pot of stew that he threw it out of his apartment window. I suppose that's the equivalent of the television out of the hotel if you're a rock star. He snapped a violin in half when he was a young student in a practice session, punched a copyist in the face. I shouldn't be laughing, but it's amusing. For incorrectly transcribing music. Housemaids were often quit or fired within weeks. And my personal favorite anecdote is that he stormed out mid-performance at an aristocratic social gathering because someone was talking over him playing, and he declared, "For such pigs, I do not play, and walked out. So it actually gives quite a good Gary Oldman, who is very good in this movie. It does give we do get a good sense of the chaotic and wonderful, explosive and emotional and abusive nature of Beethoven in this movie.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think he does play the character very well. It's a very dynamic character, and I think he does play it very well. The only other thing I was going to make in terms of comparison to Amadeus, actually, that I thought of at the end of the film is obviously two composers very close to in period, and we see Mozart be buried in sort of a common mass burial site, and we see Beethoven's actual grave. He has his own sort of gravestone memorial, and I just like that sort of with the two films being so similar in many regards. It was nice to also have that final sort of memorial of the two, and to see how that they got laid to rest. In such different opposing ways as well.
Historically inaccurate tombstone. I have to point out, Jack, that I believe, and the pedants will be delighted, I've come up with this, that Beethoven was exhumed after I think 20 or 30 years after he was buried, and then because he was in quite um, a small grave
Mm.
burial, and then they brought him somewhere else and put up this big obelisk thing
Yes,
that you see in
yes,
the
the
movie.
current, yes, the one in the film, yeah.
So for the era that's supposed to be in a film, that is a mistake. That should have been a small headstone. Great. So let's get on to our list of questions then, Jack. We ask of every movie. So we discussed already Too Long, Too Short. We thought this could be like a 6-8 part Netflix piece. Probably would be better suited to that in many ways if you want to
Yes.
put in all of the themes. So favorite character or performance then, Jack? Gary Oldman did not get an Oscar nomination, to the surprise of many people. Maybe because this film wasn't so beloved by audiences. But I should remind everyone that's the eclipse of Forrest Gump in that year in the
Mhm.
Oscars. So we're talking Tom Hanks and Forrest Gump nominated and won. John Travolta in Pulp Fiction, Nigel Hawthorne in The Madness of King George, Morgan Freeman for The Shawshank Redemption. So there's some heavy hitters here.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
then Paul Newman for a film called Nobody's Fool, which I've never heard of and I
No,
haven't
I've never
seen.
heard.
And I would say you could swap him out for an Oldman. So Oldman should have got nominated for this. But he's wonderful, isn't he, in this movie?
Yes, and I think he is my favorite performance of the film, but I think it's also because there isn't anyone else who really has the presence in the film to sort of rival him. I mean, I'm a massive fan of Gary Oldman, so not to take away from his brilliant performance, and I think you're right. Sort of the film itself lets him down as an actor because the film maybe isn't quite so focused and it wasn't quite such a success. It maybe plays down how good he was in the film. But I also think he didn't really have that on screen second person to play off throughout the whole film. Because we're always looking at other characters.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of Gary Oldman. He's done some great stuff. I
Mm.
love him in Leon. I love him as Jean-Baptiste Emmanuel Zorg in The Fifth Element. He's done some great stuff. He's done some
Yeah,
shite as well. Let's
yeah,
not beat around the bush.
yeah.
But I think you're right. In this movie, he's kind of left. He's isolated, isn't he? Because the rest of the cast, I've got to say, I've not heard of a lot of them, which is not always a problem. Who
No.
am I to say that? But I just don't think it's. I really think that this suffers from bad. I was thinking a lot about this because there's some really rough scenes in this movie, and I think it's bad direction. I think it is
Yes.
bad direction. I think that, like the fact that I give an example right at the beginning, we've got the scene where they find his will and letters and the Immortal Beloved letter, and his older Beethoven's brother, who's there, is like so over the top. The acting is just like he's shouting and he's going.
Yep.
It's just really bad. It doesn't work at all, and I think really that that's direction. I think. Obviously, it's difficult to know from film to film, but I think there's some shite directing in this. Yeah, I agree with you. And to be honest with you, I wouldn't really talk much about the rest of the cast. I think they're all fairly. I think probably the best one is the sister-in-law, who gives a very believable performance.
Yes. Yes, she does.
Joanna Testager is her name. I've never heard of her, but I think she gives a great performance in this movie. And then everybody else is not so. I'm not so interested really in their performance. Favorite scene, Jack? What's your favorite scene?
I think the one that really comes to mind when I got to the end of the film and sort of recapped in my mind is I like the one, where Beethoven sat at the piano. He thinks he's alone, and he shuts the lid and he puts his head down to try and sort of feel the vibrations. And not, whether or not that's particularly accurate. Beethoven was known to be a very loud pianist as he got more and more deaf because he was trying to hear the notes. He actually got moved out of many residencies because he was playing too loud, too late, all the time. But it seemed like a really nice moment where you're sort of looking into this character who, he does have a very strong personality. Does have a temper, and in that moment he seemed quite vulnerable, almost sort of just sat there trying to play the piano, knowing that he can't really hear it.
Yeah, it makes you feel for him, doesn't it? Even though he's an abusive ass for a lot of the
Yes.
time in this movie, it's
Yeah.
moments like that you can feel some of that frustration. I just wanted to come back to that because there's a scene in this movie where his dad puts him up as a child protege, and he's playing in the court scene, and it actually is very reminiscent of those scenes from Amadeus where the wigs, which obviously went out of fashion by the time we get to Beethoven, because as it says in this movie, a lot of them ended up in baskets, as in the guillotined off the heads of people.
Yes.
But there's that scene where he says that his dad forced him to play and he wasn't very good, and he broke 4 strings on the piano. And I thought, as a kid, that's
Yeah.
how hard is he playing this thing? Anyway, so but that scene actually is very interesting because that's like a little touch back to Amadeus. So I enjoyed that.
Mm.
I think there's a great scene where he's losing the plot basically, and there's a great soundscape, and he's trying to conduct an orchestra, but he can't hear what's going on, and he keeps
Yes.
going from the beginning.
Yep.
And that's great. It's historically inaccurate, but that I think is a really good way of showing his isolation. I think isolation is one of the themes of his of him
absolutely.
there. There are some rough scenes of, as I've mentioned, even the kind of stuff when he's much later in the movie when there's kids kind of poking him with a stick when he's kind of like this drunk tramp and he's shouting at the kids to get away. Reminded me of Anthony Hopkins in Legends of the Fall. Definitely worth listening to that episode. We've covered it on the pod.
Yep.
And I also thought, the scene where we have the Ninth Symphony, and it's his great crescendo, and he comes on
Yes.
stage, and apparently really did. It is true that he couldn't hear the applause of the audience, and someone had to touch him on the shoulder and say, "Turn around and have a look."
Yep.
I was thinking, are we really rooting for him? Because in that scene, it's kind of like, actually, he's a good lad. He's written all this music. Anton Schindler at one point says, "I couldn't hate a man who writes such wonderful music." And I was thinking, are we actually rooting for him? He's been a complete arsehole. He's really abused his nephew. We find out that it's his son. I've got a bone to pick with the end of this movie, I should mention. But are we really feeling for Beethoven in that scene? I didn't really felt like that's great and everything, but this guy's still an arsehole. I like the fact that he's an arsehole. I like the fact he's not a pure goody. And I didn't really get there with that scene that we should sort of feel some kind of wonderful to feel sorry for him. Do you know what I mean? It didn't 100% work for me.
The Ninth Symphony is one of the things that really defined the movement into the Romantic period and really defined Beethoven as a composer. But you're right, by that point, we've sort of seen the side that, potentially, the statement is, his audience never really saw the real him. And, as an audience clapping for his music, they only see, as is many composers and many musicians, you only see them as a musician. You only see them through their music. And so what they're like, behind closed doors is not, even now, is not to some people all that important. And certainly back then, I imagine most of his fans wouldn't know a lot about him as a private person. But yeah, as the audience, I was not really rooting for him at that point. No,
I've got several problems with the end scene in this. The reveal that the Immortal Beloved is his sister-in-law and his nephew is actually his son, which gave me a great kind of dopamine buzz when I was watching it. Like, ooh, that's interesting. That's a cool little twist. But then when it came to the end of the movie, as I always find, it's just maybe a personal thing with those kind of reveal twists. It's why I can't get on with horror films a lot of the time. It kind of felt me like, yeah, but what's the theme of this movie? Well, it needed a bit more for me. But I've got serious problems with the end of this movie when we see the hotel scene where he's meeting with his immortal beloved,
Yep.
Number one, why are they meeting in a hotel so far away from everywhere? How is she able to get there?
Yep.
And yet he gets stuck in a storm on a carriage and can send a messenger to send her a letter, but can't get on a horse himself.
Yep.
It doesn't make any sense. How do they manage to miss each other to go when they're in the hotel, going to and from the same room? I don't understand. And then surely all of this, I know this is not the point of the movie, but surely all of this could be solved with a very simple conversation. I just, I just felt like this great reveal that we have at the end of this movie, this kind of like aha moment, this kind of hook, this revelatory experience we have, and then we've got the Ninth Symphony and everything coming in.
Yep.
I was thinking, yeah, but it's not. It just seems a stupid place to meet. Why?
Yes.
Why? I suppose it's the equivalent of meeting in a Holiday Inn or something for an affair. I don't know, off the M4 or something. I don't know, but it just doesn't make any sense to me. Important question, Jack. Very important question. What part should Mel Gibson, Daniel Day-Lewis, or Marlon Brando have played? Obviously, we've got Daniel Day-Lewis as a shoe-in. He would have been an amazing Beethoven. One can imagine.
Yes, I thought. To be fair, I thought Daniel Day-Lewis. I think either he could have been someone like Beethoven, or I think actually he could have brought a bit more character to Schindler. Because Schindler, I think, is someone who's underutilized in this film. He's sort of the main person who carries. He feels a little bit like a Salieri in the fact that he's the one sort of carrying the story forward. It's not him telling it directly, but it's him going from character to character to get them to tell the story. So he feels like he's very much the plot device of, okay, how do we get from one person to another? But he's sort of underutilized in actually his role. He's very prominent in Beethoven as a historical figure because he was the first person to write a biography. He did have this goal to try and create Beethoven as this, godlike figure almost. And in doing so, he would actually keep out a lot of, records that made Beethoven out to be maybe not so nice. He also, he was responsible for sort of distancing Beethoven socially from people. Him and Beethoven actually fell out. It's sort of shown in this that there's a small disagreement with him, but actually they did fall out for many years. And so, it would have been cool to explore Schindler a little bit more. And I think Daniel Day-Lewis could have done a good job at that. And actually not really a reference to Mel Gibson, but one review I did read of this was discussing how the inaccuracies and the bombardment of so-called facts hits you like a Mel Gibson film.
Yeah, Mel would be proud, although he may have taken this to the next level. I'm rapidly trying to think probably something to do with Napoleon, probably Beethoven, because Mel would be magnetized towards the personality of Napoleon. Maybe they've got to have a scene where they're together, or I don't know. Did they meet? I think they did, didn't they?
Napoleon and Beethoven?
I don't know. I believe so. I don't know.
I'm sure he would explore that though.
Who should do the DVD commentary? Whose voice are we not hearing in this movie that we should hear?
It'd be obvious to say Beethoven himself, because we're not really hearing this from Beethoven's perspective. We're hearing it from a lot of other people's perspective. So it would be interesting. It would obviously apply a lot of clarity to the film if we could hear sort of his opinions. I do think, again, Schindler. I think Schindler's just a character who's underutilized in this film. So I think it would be really interesting to hear his sort of commentary. But I think what would be, this is a bit more of an artistic approach, but I would say almost you want the Immortal Beloved to be the commentator, sort of, revealing herself throughout the film. This is
that's fine, Jack. You can go straight into Suits corner. That's not a problem.
Yeah.
No, I agree. With you. It'd be good to hear. It'd be good to get some a view on that. So a companion film for this. We've got Amadeus, of course.
Yeah,
but there are a few other Beethoven movies.
Yes, yeah. So I would say it has to be Amadeus. Unfortunately, for some parts, because it is always compared to that film. So I think it is good to have it as a reference. But yeah, I think there are other films that could be a good companion film. And actually, I think other films that aren't necessarily about any musician, because this is more about just a historical figure and their romantic relationships more than it is to do with a musician.
I'm just Googling historical romance movies because as we've talked about, it's more that than a kind of historical movie in many respects.
Yes.
Romance, live Googling here, always good quality content for a podcast. Historical romance movies. Oh, it's going to come up with like Shakespeare in Love and stuff like that, isn't it? Which I can't, I
Oh,
won't
yes.
recommend to won't recommend to anyone. Yeah, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. Maybe it's not quite that far, but I kind of have a feeling that maybe that's more kind of this kind of vein.
Yeah.
For our Hall of Fame, Jack, one item, a prop or historical item that you would put in a movie, what would it be?
I think it would have to be the letter itself. That's what sparked this. Well, it's a 200-year debate. The whole film itself all comes from a letter. So
Yeah, I thought of something that we don't see in this because I know this is late Beethoven. We're basically seeing him in his later years, but I was thinking, did he just kind of start going deaf and then just sort of not accept it, but not do much about it? Well, he did have reading a lot of ear trumpets, those hilarious
okay.
old hearing aids, and I would, although we don't see it in this movie, and I think probably because in most of this movie he's too old. He stopped using them in 1818. I understand because they didn't work for him anymore. But probably more accurate would to have Gary Oldman with this kind of big, stupid-looking brass metal ear trumpet, listening to people the whole time. Some were made for him by a guy called Johann Nepomuk Metzel, who was the inventor of the metronome. So a nice bit of trivia there.
Yes.
But that was something that's not in this movie that should be in this movie. Ear trumpets. Probably not the most cinematic thing to show Gary Oldman doing. I rapidly had an image of, I think there's a scene in The Patriot where Mel is making a stirring speech and someone's listening with an ear trumpet, and it just looks funny. What would happen in the sequel if there was one? Obviously, we've talked about, so we've got Amadeus, which takes us from Mozart and overlaps with this into Beethoven. I was thinking then, composers that come a bit later, Schubert, who is buried next to Ludwig van Beethoven in real life, Mendelssohn, Brahms, and Schumann. Now, I didn't know that, listeners. I'll just clarify that. I've looked that up, but those are the composers that were directly influenced. Obviously, Beethoven influenced a lot of composers, but those are the ones that sort of come next. So maybe a film about one of those four.
Yeah, I think if there was going to be a continuation of like a series of composer films, then I think absolutely one of those would make the most sense. Another film about Beethoven himself, I think it even needs to be a film that actually follows the musical side of Beethoven's life, and express a bit more clearly why he's considered a genius. Or it should be almost like a prequel to this film and show a bit more of the lead up to the moment that we sort of meet Beethoven as already an accomplished composer.
I don't want to sound even more like an autistic nerd, but can we just ditch the romance stuff and make a movie about Beethoven that focuses on, French Revolution, Napoleon, Age of Enlightenment, Age of Reasoning, and all of that stuff and how that influences work? I would find that much more interesting.
There is so much interesting stuff about Beethoven, and I think it does deserve a good film. Beethoven does deserve his Amadeus quality of film.
Have you got anything for Pedant's Corner? I've got quite a few things here.
I haven't found anything actually.
Well, don't worry. I'll fill you in. Factual error. What on earth is the conductor at the premiere of The Ninth doing with a baton? This was not used until around 1849. And the premiere of The Ninth was in 1824. Factual error. When the so-called Immortal Beloved visits Beethoven's grave at the end of the film, I mentioned this, it is an 8-foot obelisk. Interesting that they know the height just by watching the celluloid. But the original grave was about 2 feet tall and on the other side of Vienna in a different cemetery. Beethoven was exhumed in the 1800s and moved to his current location with the 8-foot obelisk along with Schubert. The woman is visiting a grave which was built 30 years after she died. And the final one I've got here, Countess Erdödy is shown to be playing a violin, which is inaccurate as she never did. And a disability, brackets, which is also not shown, prevented this. She was, however, a very able pianist, which comes to mind. What disability did she have? I couldn't find this out by Googling it. What disability did she have that allowed her to play the piano, but that did not allow her to play the violin?
That's interesting. I don't know that one, but yeah, that's
Is it like John McCain famously couldn't raise his arms
yeah,
above his shoulders?
it could be upper arm potentially.
Kind of. I don't know. No idea. Okay, so did you get anything for Suits Corner, Jack?
No,
No.
I couldn't find anything for that.
Me neither. So we'll move on to
Potentially because of the sort of lack of knowledge and
interest. I think.
interest in this film. Yeah,
It is. It is interesting. There's. You know, I don't want to get too meta. Well, we're missing something for Suits Corner, so maybe this is fitting. It's interesting how we remember films if they capture the zeitgeist and they kind of get into that slipstream of popular consciousness, and movies like this were just completely forgotten. And so there's way less trivia, there's way less stuff that's easily Googleable, about easy to look up about how it was made, or even reviews. I found it a little bit difficult to find reviews for this movie. It's just kind of been forgotten because the information has never been reproduced, because it never had that kind of impact that other films do.
Yeah, absolutely.
The historiography of historical movies. So, Jack, let's move on then to your coveted marks out of 10. Give us a roundup of Immortal Beloved, what it did for you, what it didn't do for you, and your marks out of 10.
If I was to, come into it critical as a historical movie, I think I'd give it maybe a 4 out of 10. But taking into the fictional side of it, which lots of historical movies do, and try and remove the inaccuracies, maybe I'd give it 6.5, 7.
I gave it 6.5. That's what I had, because I was kind of a little bit seduced in the last 20 minutes where we have this reveal for a moment there, and then I kind of thought, as I've mentioned, it's not a very particularly well refined movie, as we've talked about for the rest of the pod. So I've given it 6.5, but it was enjoyable. It was a really, really good watch. It's really worth it. But I just don't think it's not up the dizzy heights. I think we both gave Amadeus a glowing 9.5. So for me, it wasn't quite there.
No, I agree. But yeah, it was a enjoyable film to watch. I mean, in terms of its length, although it felt a bit unfocused, there was never a point where I was, looking at my watch, waiting for it to be over. It was a good watch and I enjoyed it, but it just doesn't do for me what I was hoping a film about Beethoven would do.
I think that the thing I like most about this movie is that the opening shot, we have the credit sequence where it says Gary Oldman, and there's an old man on screen. That was my favorite part of this movie. Super. So, Jack, how can our listeners follow you? What are you up to? How can people follow you and get in contact?
Well, I am on most social media online. I'm at Jack CT Adams. So I'm just in the process of putting together a culmination of some compositions that I'll be putting out over the rest of the year, hopefully, and potentially some performances. So if you follow me on any of those places, you might find out more.
Brilliant. Well, you've got to send us those when everything's released. Very much looking forward to it. Maybe one day we'll be talking about a film featuring you.
Oh, yeah, we can dream.
Gary Oldman will be playing
you.
Yeah. Super, Jack. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Yes, you can email us at historicalmoviespodcast@gmail.com. Is the best way of getting in contact. If you're watching on YouTube, please leave us a comment, a like, and subscribe. It really helps the podcast. And if you give us a review on your chosen platform, particularly Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that makes a huge difference to us as well. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Historical Movies Podcast. That's it for this episode of the Historical Movies Podcast. Don't forget to leave us a review on your chosen podcast platform. Spotify and Apple Podcasts make a huge difference to the algorithm. And if you're on YouTube, don't forget to leave a comment or a like or subscribe. Thanks very much for listening. We'll see you in the next episode.